everyone, and welcome to our second week of the Farmland Drainage and the Environment Conference. My name is Lindsay Boucher, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's session. We are kicking things off here this week with Murray Hidlebaugh, who will present on quantifying carbon sequestration in wetlands and the impact from farmland drainage. So before I introduce Murray, I'd like to just take a moment to acknowledge the numerous treaties across Saskatchewan, and that includes Treaty Number 2, Number 4, 5, 6, 8, and 10. Saskatchewan is the ancestral home of the Plains Cree, Saulteaux, Nakota Assiniboine, Dakota, Lakota Sioux, and the Dene Siouxland people. Saskatchewan is also the traditional home of the Métis Nation, and I'd like to acknowledge and to thank the diverse Indigenous people whose footsteps have marked this land for centuries. This conference is brought to you by the Citizens Environment Alliance, as well as many like-minded organizations. Our goal here is to increase the awareness of farmland drainage in Saskatchewan and the different imperatives and the different factors that influence this complex topic. So just a few housekeeping notes today for your presentation. Your mics are all on mute. We will be taking questions throughout the presentation, but you can just type them in, and myself and Murray will have a moderated discussion at the end of the discussion. So you can type your questions in now, and I'll be getting back to them at the end of the discussion, of the presentation, sorry. So without further ado, I will introduce our speaker, Murray. So Murray Hidlebaugh comes to us from the National Farmers Union. He was raised on a farm in Choice Land. He operated a tree farm with a parcel of land on the irrigation canal just south of Broadwell. In 1985, he installed the first field drip irrigation system in Saskatchewan. Murray operates a small greenhouse operation now, and he has been involved in extensive studies at Tobin Lake, Caudette Lake, Fishing Lake, Quill Lake, and Waldsee Lake. This experience expanded his interest in farmland drainage issues. So Murray comes to us with a personal lived experience where drought was a bigger problem than flooding. His parents moved north from Assiniboia to escape drought on the prairies in the 30s, and a line that he grew up hearing quite often from his dad was that you can live with too much water, but you can't live without water. Murray has been involved for about 15 years on the Water Issues Committee with the Saskatchewan Environmental Society, of which he is a former board member. He is a charter member of the North Saskatchewan River Basin Council Watershed Group and has had the opportunity to work on the Citizens Environmental Alliance within the two conferences, and as well as a number of papers. So he is a member of the NFU and is involved in research involving farming and the environment, and his current interest is in the development of an effective provincial water management policy. So with that, I'll pass it over to you, Murray.
Okay, thank you, Lindsay, and appreciate the introduction. If I could get on the slides, and the conference organizers that invited me to present is a real benefit for me, because I have to get the validity of the material that I have. If I can get it checked out, that was one of my problems that I had with it. And you'll see that as we go along. The project actually started with Darren Qualman, and he's coordinating a farmers discussion group who are seeking ways to adjust the farming practices to reduce their environmental impact while maintaining the viability of the farm. He asked me if I was interested in looking at research related to wetlands and carbon sequestration. I've actually been involved in a lot of source water protection and wetland conservation projects, but I hadn't actually looked at carbon. As I got deeper into the search for answers, I found that it wasn't nearly as straightforward as I expected. I also found that the numbers, if they are correct, and I've interpreted them correctly, that the wetlands are much more important as carbon sinks than I've been heard in other discussions. So the project presentation is in 4 parts. The first are the 4 questions that came up through the NFU, and one was what is the capacity of wetlands to sequester carbon? A second was how many hectares of wetlands are drained annually with a percentage. Third was the quantity of greenhouse gas emissions per hectare per year. And the fourth that flowed out of this was what is the rate of carbon sequestered from wetland restoration, and compare that to no-till carbon sequestration. As I went through this part to do the paper, I came across the challenges that I thought were fairly significant. And so I added those as my list under access to research and the application of findings. There's a short conclusion and then the questions. In the project, I focused on the prairie pothole region of Saskatchewan. This is because the conversion of freshwater mineral soil wetlands is likely more significant than this in terms of carbon emissions than the peatland regions of the northern part. The maps are provided courtesy of Jared Wolf. The one on the left shows the extent of the prairie pothole region stretching from Iowa to the Peace River. I put that in because I was absolutely amazed at how big this area is, and when I saw it on a map, it was a lot bigger than I thought. So I thought other people like me might be interested. Those that are involved, probably this is old news, but for me it wasn't. The map on the right, also provided by Jared, shows a classification of watersheds based on hierarchical clustering of principal components. I think this approach might be looked at in relation to identify locations where the wetland study was done. And I'll be referencing that several times, is that there's quite a wide range of differences. And I found that I couldn't locate that in a lot of the papers. I put in this slide because it's a bit of personal history of the Hidlebaugh family. And when I saw the map, I was interested in that we traced our history of our great-grandfather moving up the family from Guthrie County, Iowa to homestead at Redverse in 1906. Then my grandfather and family drove to Heidelberg, Alberta in the Peace River to homestead in 1919. From reading the history of the homesteading in our family, as well as from stories when talking to my grandfather and father and uncles, I'm quite sure they didn't realize that they had traveled almost the entire distance of the prairie pothole region. However, they were aware of the wide differences in climate, the wide differences in soil conditions, the wide difference required in farming practices, and how farming equipment had changed over the years. And as long as I can remember, the lack of water was a major concern. However, I would digress on that. The first question that came up was the capacity of wetlands to sequester carbon in tons per hectare. And I added tons per acre as well, because many of us that are a little older, acre is what we understand. So in the answer to carbon sequestration, what I found was it varied between 175.1 tons of carbon to 205 tons of carbon. And I found there was a lot of other wide variances. I just chose those two. One of the papers I found is this chart, and it was very useful for me. It gave a summarized overview of not only the variation in the numbers, but an explanation of why those numbers might have occurred. When you look from 87 to 205, that's quite a range. I arbitrarily chose Badeau and Bedard-Hahn numbers because they seem to have studied the areas that had a major focus in Saskatchewan. And I settled on the Badeau number for further calculations because I was able to cross-reference his information, and I found it consistent with calculations. On the right of the chart, which says number of sites, I was unable to find out anything about where the sites were or the extent to which the data might have overlapped among other researchers. I was also unable to find how close these sequestration numbers were to what the maximum capacity at those sites were at that time. I tried to find this information because I thought it would be useful in calculating what the future capacity for carbon sequestration might be at that site over a next number of years. The carbon sequestration capacity was mentioned in many of the papers, but it didn't actually have a way to know whether that site was at capacity or if it still had capacity. which led me to the slide dealing with defining carbon sequestration and looking at maximum storage capacity of the soil. Then I came across a whole new area that I needed to be aware of, which was several researchers noted the importance of knowing maximum capacity. They also had research that showed that the sequestration rate slowed as capacity was being reached. There are researchers doing this for both wetlands and for no-till carbon sequestration. When I came across this schematic describing the distinctions between mitigating carbon dioxide increases in the atmosphere and when there's a change in soil carbon, that was interesting, but I still have trouble understanding the difference. I put it in there just to remind me that there is a difference. The other difference that I came across was I did learn that carbon and carbon dioxide distinctions need to be made. And a 3.67 is an important number to use to do conversion. I had done some carbon emission calculations from the data I had, but when I checked with Darren Qualman before I got too far along, he noted that when I was doing calculations with carbon sequestration and carbon emissions, I wasn't taking into account the variance in atomic mass between the carbon and the oxygen. I put in this chart to remind me that I had to use 3.67 when calculating conversions, and it made a significant difference in the calculations, as most of the scientists would already know. The variance in freshwater mineral soil sequestration capacity, as I mentioned before, is interesting, and I think it needs to be looked at. I found that the capacity varies considerably in various areas of Saskatchewan, but I couldn't find a lot of data on it. The picture on the right shows the soil horizons at a study site in Saskatchewan, and the schematic on the left shows horizons with root growth and carbon sequestration points. I found the research that indicated that about 50% of the carbon sequestration was in the subsoil horizons, the B and C. Plant root depth was important. Researchers indicated that soil nutrients, plant type, and moisture conditions were also important. Roots play a significant role in carbon sequestration, and roots don't go looking for moisture. It made me think that even a wetland that was dry on top had a significant role in maintaining the carbon sequestration because it retained moisture below. However, I could find no research on this. The second question, and related to estimating wetland drained annually, I chose the 11,800 hectares from a Badeau paper, and there was another paper that had the same. The estimate of Saskatchewan total wetlands, 1.7 million hectares remaining, was fairly consistent. And the estimate percentage of annual loss of wetlands was also consistent. However, an example of a conflicting number was Smith Creek, which had in 1958, 8,804 hectares of wetlands. In 2007, 6,568 hectares, which was 2,236 hectares drained, which would have been about 0.05% per year. However, when you look at the maps, which 1958 to 2009, it would appear that the drainage at 2009 was quite a bit more than what was projected in the paper at 2007, but I had no way of checking it. In terms of estimating a wetland drain annually, the way I came to this conclusion was I looked at conflicting data. I found data that said there was 10,000 acres or 4,000 hectares of wetlands drained per year, all the way up to 11,800 hectares per year. For example, in one of the webpage article on wetlands, it says Saskatchewan wetlands are in jeopardy due to agricultural conversion and urban expansion. Wetland loss across the province is estimated at 28 acres per day. When I figured this out, this is about 10,000 acres per year, which others had, which would equal about 4,000 hectares per year. So there were several reviews or research papers that talked about the 10,000 acres per year. The research paper by Badeau, and there were others, that estimates that more than 500,000 hectares of wetlands have been lost since the 1950s, and an additional 11,800 hectares are lost annually. So in my calculation, I took between 1950 and 2016, 66 years of draining 500,000 hectares would require an average of about 7,600 hectares per year. So my thought was there'd be less at the start and more now, and that's why I chose the 11,800 hectare number. I think the 10,000 acres or 4,000 hectares a year can't be accurate, since it would take 125 years to have drained 500,000 hectares of wetlands. And again, as the Smith Creek one, that is really difficult, and I'm not sure how to, the calculations don't seem to match the map. The third question was yearly greenhouse gas emissions from wetland drainage. I calculated that would be about 3.8 million tons of carbon dioxide per hectare per year, using 326.6 tons of carbon dioxide per hectare per year, with an estimated drainage of 11,800 hectares of wetlands. The map at the bottom really doesn't relate to this. It relates more to how my mind felt as I went through the research papers to try to figure out and keep track of all the numbers that were going in and out of the wetland system. I thought this was kind of a neat little mind map. When I did the calculations, which I mentioned for above, I was using Badeau's emissions of approximately 89 megagrams of carbon, which I translated that into 89 tons of carbon per hectare, would equal 326.6 tons per hectare. If the drainage was at 11,800 hectares, the calculation would be 3.8 million tons. I'm just wondering if I made any errors there, if there's another way it might have been calculated. One of the issues I found in trying to work on calculations of carbon emissions from wetland drainage was when the 89 megagrams of carbon per hectare was calculated per year, how long did that take? Is that 89 milligrams as soon as the water is gone, or how long? And I wondered if the calculations included the ditch, because there's about 43,560 square feet per acre, and some of these ditches I estimated could be an acre or two of exposed surface. So, and particularly when some of it seemed to be going down into the horizon B and C, I thought that might be significant. So but I was unable to find any research on it. And what I was looking at here was that based on 205 tons of carbon per hectare per year sequestered and 89 tons of carbon per hectare released, it would mean there was 116 tons of carbon remaining in the B and C horizons, at least. And I just wondered if that was released at some time, or were there a percentage of that being released over time? The fourth question was the rate of carbon sequestration with wetland restoration and no-till. The wetland restoration, the data was fairly consistent that about 2.7 tons of carbon per hectare per year were sequestered in wetlands that had been drained, which would mean that it removes about 9.9 tons of carbon dioxide per hectare per year. No-till sequesters about 0.57 tons of carbon per hectare per year and removes about 2.1 tons of carbon dioxide per hectare per year. There was no doubt that the no-till seeding is more efficient when there are less turns around sloughs, but no-till carbon sequestration is not nearly as efficient as wetlands. However, size and location of wetlands are important. While one large wetland does not sequester the same amount of carbon as several small wetlands of the same total, the area of the restoration also needs to replicate the size and distribution. In this case, the data was that a large number of small wetlands cannot be mitigated by the restoration of an equal area, creating a large wetland, and Van Meter and others had this information. So using Stewart and Cantrud wetland classification, class 2, which was temporary wetlands, class 3 seasonal ponds, class 4 semi-permanent ponds, didn't equal the class 5 of permanent ponds. And there's actually some research that if the wetlands get too large with water body and not enough plant material, that their carbon dioxide equivalent emissions, particularly methane, could actually increase. So in summary for the project, I came up with the capacity of wetlands to sequester carbon at 205 tons of carbon per hectare, that there were about 11,800 hectares per acre, or 11,800 hectares per year drained, which would be about 0.7% of the total. There are 3.8 million tons of carbon dioxide per hectare per year emitted. And in terms of restoration, the wetland restoration removed about 9.9 tons of carbon dioxide per hectare per year, while no-till removed about 2.1 tons of carbon dioxide per hectare per year, which led into the list of challenges that I had. And for my purposes, I found this to be an opportunity to check out what might be done about some of the concerns or whether they're shared. My first one was finding and verifying relevant research and who is doing it. My observation was that I attended a University of Saskatchewan Ag and Water Research Expo in June 2019 and found it very valuable. There was posters and we sat down in round tables with the researchers and the students. However, that couldn't last, and trying to find who is doing research and determining its validity is really problematic. For example, I reviewed 2 papers assessing wetland restoration strategies. One was Van Meter. The results of our study suggest that to effectively carry out a landscape approach to wetland restoration, it's crucial that the size, distribution, and spatial architecture of historical wetland sites within a watershed be not only understood, but be used as a guideline for prioritizing sites for both restoration and regulatory protection. Then I had a second paper, Water Management Project at Langham with the Saskatchewan Water Security Agency, described as a water management plan over approximately 40 acres within Discovery Farms that contains wetlands, is a consolidation project which will drain water from several small wetlands into a larger, more permanent wetland. When I analyzed Van Meter's research findings, it indicates that draining several small sloughs into a large wetland creates a false equivalent. Referencing the Water Management Project, there is general agreement in the research that no-till is an efficient method to expand crop production. There is also general agreement both in the literature and by farmers that straight, flat, dry land is best for this type of farming. However, there is evidence that a large wetland is not a substitute for small wetlands. How does what appears to be conflicting research, such as between Van Meter and the Water Management Project, not get wider scrutiny among interest groups when government is proposing policy on wetland drainage? Another issue was connecting with researchers to validate interpretation. And my question always as I went through was the interpretation of the numbers I had consistent with what the researchers thought. One example was trying to determine what happens to the sequestered carbon that wasn't released by drainage. My interpretation was when a wetland is drained, it releases a total of 89 tons of carbon per hectare when that water is gone, and whether that's in the first year or not, and I didn't know how to check that out. And Badeau had stated that a wetland sequesters 205 megagrams of carbon per hectare. Does that mean that 116 megagrams of carbon per hectare remains in the wetland forever after drainage? And what are the possibilities of its release as the freshwater mineral soil wetland area continues to dry over time? I was also unable to find research that had data that measured carbon still sequestered after drainage and farming started, or the rate of release of carbon in succeeding years. I think wet capacity to sequester carbon deserves more study or at least more public analysis. These numbers appear significant to me, and I've seen little discussion on this. My third area was access to research. This one was a real problem for me since I'm no longer connected to secondary academic institutions, so don't have the codes, nor am I independently wealthy. The lack of access to libraries and lack of access to be able to connect with researchers was, with follow-up, was a problem. Areas like paywalls, request a copy from the author's libraries, and so forth. I found that difficulty relying primarily on Google. I did have some expert volunteer assistance, which was much appreciated. There is research that indicates that connecting researchers with users is a problem, which I was kind of interested in seeing. I have heard discussion that the role of the proposed Canada Water Agency might be to break down silos related to access to research. Referencing their discussion paper objectives, page 13, data and information are available to support informed freshwater decision-making at all levels. The project might be to create a wetland research section here, free at the point of access. Users as well as researchers should be part of this discussion. Challenges in terms of the application of the research findings from my perspective were also part of my list. One was to look at the purpose of research, and in the literature I found that research was supposed to be assist in solving the problem or dealing with the situation. However, I found that most of the problems I was dealing with were location specific, while I found that the data tended to be really general and hard to tie down to a location. An example in trying to access data or to assess data from the research papers that only give a general location when trying to find data for a specific location was a problem. A paper prepared by Jared Wolf and a team titled A Watershed Classification Approach That Looks Beyond Hydrology, Application to Semi-Arid Agricultural Region in Canada, I thought could be used to see if the concept they have for sub-regional study of watersheds could be applied to wetland studies on a regional basis. Being able to find data on the maximum carbon storage capacity and what the potential is for carbon sequestration for wetlands in an identified subregion would be very useful. It would also be useful to discuss the extent to which current wetland research is intended to be user-friendly and how user-friendly is determined. Users usually have a specific location they're seeking information about. Researchers often use general terms such as total wetlands without writing out how much that total is in a specific area. I found some of the research papers included a glossary to assist those of us who have minimal technical background in that area, but most of the papers didn't. Also in the papers I read, there was general information about sites and locations, but I found none that gave location descriptions or GPS readings that would enable me to identify the location. I think I would have found that information useful. The second one is I think a wetland policy is needed and it's being worked on. But I think part of the challenge is water and wetland controlled by government, the commons, or is water and wetland controlled by private ownership, the enclosure of the commons? I think the federal and provincial government should address the conflict between non-market and market valuing of wetlands. The example I had was, well, there's research on how to assess the market and non-market value of wetlands. I can find no statement by either federal or provincial government ministries that wetlands in their location have public value that should be considered when discussing value of drainage. I wonder, is it no longer a wetland when the wet water is removed, whether through drainage or evaporation? From the research, it appears that the location and the characteristics of a wetland are important and that there is value in restoring wetland as a public good, but it appears government ministries have no written public statement on this. If wetland management is the domain of the private sector, would the price of carbon dioxide emissions per ton be considered part of the cost of the wetland drainage project? The main issue I see is that whether wetlands are public property controlled by government as a commons, or if they're private property controlled by the owner, and which would be an enclosure of the commons. If wetlands are considered part of the commons, then the provincial, municipal, and indigenous governments would have a responsibility to work together to protect them as a public good. If wetlands are deemed private property, the owner has control of their property. Property owners can be assessed for both property improvements as well as billed for waste disposal. Wetland drainage would at least fall under waste disposal. When I take waste material to the garbage dump, I pay a tipping fee established by the owner of the waste disposal facility. The federal government has established the equivalent of a dumping fee for carbon dioxide. It puts a tangible cost on carbon dioxide pollutions. So I looked at the capacity of wetlands to sequester carbon and also the amount released as a result of farmland drainage. I did some calculations to try to estimate the cost benefit of drainage for agricultural production. The cost benefit was 1 hectare of wetland drainage in the year 2023. The cost estimate doesn't include construction costs of the drainage facility. However, drainage released 32.6 tons of carbon dioxide per hectare per year. The price in 2023 is pegged at $50 a ton. So the emissions cost for drainage would be $16,330. In terms of the benefit, the credit for no-till that a person would get for sequestration would be 2.1 tons of carbon dioxide per hectare per year, which would be $105. And the crop net return on canola would be $125. And I calculated this based on $11 a bushel, going at 40 bushel to the acre, with a $390 per acre cost of production. These figures are estimate based on some discussions with farmers, some research of the ag webpage, and also the cost of production was as total a cost as I could get and as accurate as I could get. Those numbers may change, but essentially the $11 a bushel is quite a bit higher than has been for the last 3 or 4 years. So the net return from drained hectare of wetland, I figured would be $230 per year. This would leave a payback on the investment of 70 to 71 years. And I'm not sure that that is a very good business plan. It makes expensive approach to expanding capacity to produce. The third was the conflict related to farmland drainage, which the calculations would lead to. My observation, I was doing some research on rural Saskatchewan and found that the social capital, civility, trust, and networking were eroding quite rapidly, and that community bridging was lacking. In other words, inclusiveness. At about that same time, I met Phil Loring and Sarah Breen, then at the University of Saskatchewan. They were doing a study along this line in rural Saskatchewan, and Sarah Minnis just sent me a copy of their findings. It was noted that this research identifies opportunities to transform the conflict over agricultural drainage in Saskatchewan, Canada, towards collaboration. I think the paper captures the issues and shows the significant differences in perspectives related to farmland drainage among the representative participants. I also think the conservation conflict transformation model just below, along with the suggestions for addressing conflict, are really useful. I would bring attention to their findings. Evidence that conflict over drainage is not constrained to dispute level matters, which is down in is right at the top, but rather that it builds on long-term standing disagreements and deep-seated differences regarding values for the land, the role of government and governance, and the people's rights and responsibilities. I agree that to address conflict, policy development alone is not adequate. As the researchers noted, there is a need to include the creation of a process that facilitates relationship building and shared understandings, and a process that can adapt to people's changing needs and concerns. However, the researchers identified several of the deep-rooted conflicts of which I am aware and in some cases have experienced. The proposals for moving toward collaboration seem similar to effective contract negotiation principles. I think to address the times when participants in the dispute are unable to reach an agreement, there's a need to have a more robust process in place to try to resolve the dispute before engaging in legal actions in the courts. So what appears to be needed when opposing sides are unable to reach a compromise is a section dealing with setting up a process for conciliation, mediation, or arbitration. And I think this would be a provincial, municipal, and Indigenous governments collaborative approach. I suggest the lead ministry on this be the Ministry of Government Relations. Deep-rooted conflict becomes a risk to the entire community, not just to sectors of the various ministries. It's economically, socially, environmentally, and culturally a challenge. So in conclusion, I developed a greater appreciation for the complexities researchers have to deal with when measuring carbon sequestration related to wetland management. The data indicates the impact of farmland drainage of wetlands, particularly small wetlands, related to carbon sequestration and carbon dioxide emissions is significant. And I would suggest that the federal government should consider wetlands an important resource for carbon dioxide management and should include wetlands as part of agriculture's solution in its climate smart agriculture program. I would also suggest that the Water Security Agency should reassess its research that established the proposed wetlands mitigation policy that outlines, in general, landowners are required to retain wetland acres equal to 50% of the pre-drainage wetland acres. Landowners choose which wetlands are retained and where within the project area. I and a couple of others have had an opportunity to have an excellent discussion on this with 2 Water Security Agency staff, but COVID prevented planned follow-up. Hopefully, these discussions will continue. So I thank you for your time and open to questions.
Thank you so much, Murray, for that excellent presentation. Okay, so we have lots of questions here coming in, and if you have a question, please don't hesitate to type them in the question box in the dashboard there, and I'll be getting to them as we go here. All right, so Murray, the first question I have here, actually, you've mentioned a couple of times throughout your presentation that smaller wetlands have a higher capacity for carbon sequestration compared to the larger Class 5 wetlands. I was wondering if you wanted to go over why that was.
Well, it appears, for what the research showed, for instance, that Saskatchewan has the majority of their wetlands are in the small category. But the research across North America was that the smaller wetlands, it appears that they have greater capacity because of their distribution and because in the uplands, the smaller wetlands have a greater chance of success, and they trap the water in a more distributed way. The other thing that came up, and there's the researchers will be able to speak way more than I can, but the smaller wetlands seem to have more masses of grass and so forth that have root systems, where the larger wetland has a greater water body, and even the larger wetlands are more subject to anaerobic emissions of methane. So that was why I was looking at the smaller wetlands, because I think the distribution is more important, and that's why I'd spoken with Jared about this, and I think this needs to be followed up, is that we need to look at how the smaller wetlands are distributed throughout the watersheds. And mainly that's the main thing, is if you put it all in one area, it doesn't have the same sequestration capacity that a number of small areas have for root systems.
Thank you. Sorry to cut you off there. Our next question is regarding the no-till sequestration, which you had done a great comparison there about no-till versus wetland. So the question is, does the no-till sequestration result in deep sequestration, so throughout the different soil horizons, or is most of the carbon in the soil stored within the upper layers, the surface of the soil?
That was my question. That was the one I had about how deep the roots go. I've checked with several people, and I know from myself that the annuals of monoculture of the root system of canola and wheat don't go very far down, and they don't last very long. Now, there are understory material like alfalfa and clover, which we used on our tree farm to try to get rid of the salt problem, to reduce the water evaporation to control salt. And those roots went down quite a ways. So the literature, when I matched it, the peat moss or the peat areas sequestered more carbon, but a lot of that was equivalent of having more trees or more root system from the trees. So I think the sequestration from no-till is really low. I put in the highest one I found. I found ones that were way lower than that, except for the promotion papers, and they were quite high. But the researchers, I picked the highest one I could find, and I think that the problem is that the roots don't go down and they don't stay down, and also that there's not the same amount of moisture trapped when you get rid of a wetland. Even a ephemeral wetland would catch moisture during the spring thaw. If you've gotten rid of all that, if you've drained it all, you don't get that subsoil moisture retained out there. I think the research, I'd like to see more research on that because that was my question.
Great, thank you. Our next question is about, I'll just go ahead and read it, sorry. So in certain regions of Saskatchewan, a large portion of the remaining wetlands have their plant growth burnt off once a year. And so the person here is asking, given this, would wetlands carbon sequestration be more so considered carbon neutral, given that the plant growth is burned off? And they are wondering if you've come across any information in your research that acknowledges this problem or this factor.
Yes, and I've run across two issues. One is that char, and I'm not sure how much char there is. On our farms, we used to burn the extra straw and that was piling up because it wouldn't rot, and we had no way with our machinery of handling it. And we always get a really good growth, but we also summer followed 1/2 of our property, which released a tremendous amount of carbon. So with the changes, I think if you burn off or work off ephemeral soil, but if you work it, you actually destroy the integrity of it, I think. If you don't work it, but just burn it off, I'm not sure what that does to the root system. And I didn't see any research on that. I saw research that said burning it off was a problem, but I couldn't see why it was a problem, and I could not find any data that gave any numbers on what kind of a problem it was. So that was why I had that little slide in there that showed the roots going down, even though the plant material was dying on top, that they still sequestered it in the B and C horizons. There's some research being done on that, but the papers I found, I couldn't get into the past the paywalls to look at them.
Okay. Our next question regards the calculation so does the calculation for the land and valuing wetlands include increase in cropland assessment values when it comes to drainage? So more specifically, when wetlands are drained and converted to cropland, those acres can increase the value of the land and represent a direct return to the landowner. So this might be more of a comment, but would you like to address that in terms of your calculations that you made in this presentation?
Absolutely. Right now, probably the most you can get per acre in Saskatchewan would be about $2,000. Draining the wetland is about $6,600 per acre, somewhere around that, 16,800 per hectare. And my math isn't that quick, but it's around 6,000. So what actually, when somebody buys land at, and I heard this at Melfort, that the wetland was worth $250 an acre, and when it was drained, it was worth 2,000. When I calculated it out, they were putting up the cost of the carbon emission, which is set, carbon dioxide emission, which is set now. They're saying they're draining over $6,000 worth of land to make a profit of 2,000 on sales. I don't buy that as being a strategy. I mean, it's good for the person and that's where the public commons versus the enclosure of the commons comes in. And I mean, I don't disagree that there's all kinds of these discussions going on. You buy low, sell high, but if you externalize all of your environmental and social problems, I'm not sure that that's good public policy. So okay. I am against that.
All right. Our follow-up question here is again about the cost-benefit analysis. And so the person is wondering how you chose the price for the emissions, or how you came up to that price. And their question is if you have any thoughts on the validity of the price for long-term calculations. And they make a comment here about how the carbon price calculations include significant discounting. So sequestered carbon declines in value into the future, whereas some people would suggest that the calculation should actually be assigned a higher value in the future. So do you have any comments about the pricing for emissions and how that factors into the long-term calculations?
I just took that off the Government of Canada webpage, which they had said by 2023, the price of carbon would be $50 a ton. I found on a webpage too that they were discussing that by 2030 it could be $170 a ton. I didn't bother. I was just trying to show that, or I wasn't trying to show. What I was trying to look at was what is the, if you want to talk about market value, then you have to talk about market costs. And I found that a lot of the discussion was, well, we can grow $11 a bushel canola and we can get $60 a bushel. Neither of those are really true. I mean, they tend to be a bit mythical or very positive thinking. Right now, the average, I checked yesterday, and I think canola was at $8.60 a ton, or 60 cents a bushel. And so I just picked everything as 2023. Yeah, those are all just projections, but the carbon is going to go up, and I haven't seen the price of grain go up to follow it. Price of land maybe, but I don't think the price of land is going to match the carbon cost.
Okay. We also have a few more comments here. The cost-benefit analysis is getting a lot of attention as we're discussing it. And so we have a few more people who are including different factors that they'd like you to comment on. So the next one here is taking yearly yields into account from previous wetland areas and discounting high rainfall years into your calculations. Do you have any comments about that?
Yeah, what I did, I calculate this out. I farm, so, and I still have land, and so we're calculating, and I try to keep track. And I got some farmer friends that I phone and or we talk to, and they give me the information. What I did, the Agricultural Canada has average yields, and for canola, I think this year the yield was between 30 and 35 bushel an acre, sometimes lower. It was wet in some areas, dry in others, but in our area it was wet, and the yield was about 30 bushel the acre. The average yield that they have on their webpage is 40 bushel the acre. And so what I was doing was trying to calculate something that was generally acceptable. It's the same as even the price. The price now, I gave $11 a bushel. I know I was around when it was $16 a bushel for about 3 minutes. And we're still hearing about $16 a bushel canola, maybe organic, but then organic yield goes way down. So I think $50 an acre is a pretty reasonable net return. I don't know. I know of farmers that say they make way more than that, but then they leave out a whole bunch of the costs, like storage costs, transportation costs, losses, and so forth. So I'd be glad to sit down with anybody and check numbers. I got numbers on this that I've tried to validate, and in this area, I'm much more comfortable than I am with the science of carbon sequestration.
Thank you. Yes. And lastly, someone also mentioned additional considerations which fall outside of carbon sequestration, however, also factoring in the cost of downstream impacts, such as flood damage and nutrient loading. And so would you like to comment on how those costs could further be added on to the cost benefit analysis here?
Well, and that gets back to the commons. If it's private, who cares? Just put it down to the cost of doing business, and we will, be like the city of Victoria when they used to dump their raw sewage into the ocean because it wasn't a problem to anybody. I think that becomes a policy issue. And again, I saw huge numbers put around. I saw water value of something like a 1 hectare of wetlands produced $20,000 per hectare worth of water filtration. But again, my area here, I was really looking at carbon, and I was absolutely astounded at the carbon capacity in soil. And so I didn't really look at the other. I think that those, if anybody's interested in looking at a total market, those need to be looked at, but right now they're not. They're just considered externalities.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is a nice transition point here. The person is wondering, can wetland preservation be incentivized for farmers?
Well, I have a problem with that because the farmer didn't make the wetlands. So some farmer destroyed it. If somebody's going to incentivize it, other than changing it into the commons and making it like a lake, a farmer can't own a lake. Nobody can own a lake in Canada right now. You can in other parts of the world, but you can't in Canada. You can't own a lake or a river or navigable water. My thought was we need to look at that as wetlands. That's why I put in that we have lots of protection for water, sourced water. We have lots of protection for land. You can't pollute your land. You can't, in some places, you can't grow certain crops on your land. But when you mix land and water together and get a wetlands, everybody forgets about whether it has any value or not, or any protection. And so I don't see incentivizing other than saying that it wouldn't be part of the tax base and that it would be moved into the commons. In other words, a common or a community owned property, like an environmental easement. The challenge is going to be, how do you move away from the intensive no-till with the huge equipment and maintain wetlands? And I see that as being a real problem, but I don't see that as being any cheaper. It's efficient, but it's not cheaper.
Well, as you mentioned easements here, that transitions well. We have another question here asking about conservation easements. So with forage planting over 10 years, such as one of the programs that Ducks Unlimited would do, and they were wondering if you had any comments as using that as a solution or as a way to have carbon sequestration.
Well, yeah, I think that those are the kinds of things that could be looked at. The challenge that I found with the easements, so the way I understand them and the way it is on my grandfather's property, is that if somebody else comes along and they want to get out of the easement, it's not that difficult. And so if you set up an easement, there has to be some sort of in perpetuity protection of it. And sort of like the lakes and the rivers. A person can't just go up and dam a river unilaterally. Now, damming rivers is also a challenge, but you can't dump sewage in a lake and so forth. So I think that if wetlands had some sort of a significant recognition, either by their classification and location, and then start to look at those as being an important part of that particular part of the landscape, like a lake or a river, then that would make sense. Right now, I'm not sure it makes sense, because if you build a dugout and call it a wetlands, that the research doesn't show that, or draining a bunch into one area and then protecting that area wouldn't make much sense to me either.
Okay. Do you have any further comments about reestablishing wetlands or restoring wetlands, how or where it should be done?
Yeah, I was amazed at the research that showed how valuable and the wetland restoration can be. Now there is the carrying capacity and the maximum sequestration that could go in. I think it was a Bedard Hahn paper that I've read that estimated if you restored a wetland, you could have about 33 years of restoration at 9.9 tons of carbon dioxide per year. That's a fairly significant number when you start to look at $170 a ton for carbon dioxide or more. And so I think that community restoration, that's what I would suggest, that if this was a community or an RM town, sort of a community project, and that the revenues that were accrued to that went into the larger community, I think that would be a way to do it. I'm not really keen on just having it as a private strategy, because the only way it became useful was that somebody wrecked it. And I'm not sure that wrecking a thing and then fixing it, that there should be an economic benefit to maintaining something privately. I think it's a public good, but that's a debate.
Yes, it is a very hot debate. Thank you for that.
Yeah, the whole area of private ownership is and public control, or that's the commons and the enclosure of the commons. And I don't think that debate has been had on wetlands.
Yes. Well, hopefully conferences like these can help facilitate those discussions. Our next question here is about the WSA project that you mentioned in your presentation, the project at Langham. So the question is the WSA wetland consolidation project at Langham a standalone project, or are there plans to compare carbon dynamics of this project to a comparable acreage of smaller wetlands? So do you have any thoughts or comments on that?
Well, I can't speak for the Water Security Agency. This was an actual, we weren't discussing the Langham project, but with the two people I met with, we did discuss the rate of return on wetland drainage and the problem of the 50% retention without any controls on it. I think I couldn't find any more on the Langham project other than it was part of a total strategy in a number of areas by the WSA to look at what would influence their policy. What I found was, though, that it seemed to be the way the paper was written that I read was that there was the idea that if we don't, no net loss, and I've been against the concept of no net loss, and there's lots of research that shows that that's not a valid way to look after the environmental value of wetlands. And so my concern was, if there's going to be this kind of discussion, why or where is going to be the discussion on where the research conflicts? And how do you arrive at a compromise? And that's why I thought the Minnis paper was really good in talking about conflict, and I thought it needed just another section on it. But I think that if that kind of a paper model, that model was used in determining how we enter into these discussions on research, then we could at least have a policy that we knew why the decisions were made the way they were. And so, yeah, I can't find anything more on it other than it's being used as part of a larger project.
Thank
I think
you.
it's a good
Yes, and
idea. I'm not
yeah,
against the
yeah.
idea. I just think that there needs to be a way to discuss them.
Thank you. I'm just mindful of the time here. It's 11:31. I'll take one last question and then we will wrap it up here. So the last question is more so maybe a comment of referring to your section about just some of the barriers between some of the research and academic research, as well as creating user guides and having it be user friendly. So they're just wondering about mobilization and knowledge mobilization, about bringing people together to deal with this issue and to facilitate these cross boundary discussions on farmland drainage. So do you have any more concluding thoughts or last thoughts about how to bring people together to mobilize all this different knowledge that we have around the issue and how we can bring people together?
That's really a tough one. I do have, because I've been on the research side and now I'm on the user side, and researchers, and there actually is research that shows that many researchers have trouble integrating with the users. And I thought that the University of Saskatchewan Ag and Research Expo was really a good idea. I thought that there could be, I think that the facilitators need to be more than just warm bodies, but that must have been a tremendous amount of work to get those groups together. But we actually had researchers sit down, and that's when I found people like Sarah Breens and Phil Loring and that, except it's impossible to get a hold of them because they are busy, and I'm not paying them, so that becomes problematic. So in order to make the user friendly, and that the users coming in aren't just lobbying for their own particular research, I think if there was a way to have some sort of an expo like that or along that line, where it was targeted on a certain area, and then we could see what was happening, and then have facilitated little round tables that the researchers could go back and look at what they're doing, and groups like the Citizen Environmental Alliance, we were involved in that expo. We could come back and say, here's what we're doing, but we would have a connection. Right now, I don't have those connections. I can get feedback and I can get responses from researchers I know, but when I contacted all kinds of researchers, but I don't know them, I never heard back at all. And I don't disagree with that, because I probably wouldn't answer me either if I didn't know who I was. But it's just, I'm probably not alone in that area, and researchers are probably tearing their hair out with all these users that are bugging them. And so I think that we need to find a way to do that. And I thought that the Canadian Water Agency might be they actually have that in one of their objectives, and I think that would be very useful. But once a year, I think if there was a targeted discussion group between interested researchers, interested students, and users in a forum that was somewhat controlled. My thought.
Perfect. Well, Murray, once again, thank you so much for your informative presentation, as well as this great discussion that we just had. I'm sure lots of people have learned a lot about carbon sequestration in the Prairie Pothole region and just the different imperatives, the rate of emissions, and so on and so forth. So thank you for your work, and thank you for presenting it with us today. I'm just going to wrap up the day here with a few closing remarks. So just moving on here. We have sessions going on all of this week, so Monday to Friday, all starting at 10:30. If you'd like to register for further webinars, you can do that at sierraclub.ca. I've also included the link here for the Incentivized report, Findings from Farmland Drainage Roundtable Initiative. This is the precursor event that highlighted some of the issues around farmland drainage, and it's where our conference is birthed out of. So if you'd like more information on the background of farmland drainage and where we're coming from, you can check out that report, and it's housed on the Saskatchewan Environmental Society's website. Last but not least, if you would like to follow, share all our updates on this conference, And other updates on farmland drainage, you can find them at Citizens Environmental Alliance-Saskatchewan. As well, we also have recordings from our past presentations that are housed on their YouTube channel. So if you're curious, you can definitely go and check those out. Tomorrow's presentation, we are hearing from Vice Chief Heather Bear on the Indigenous perspectives on farmland drainage, so be sure not to miss that. And I'd just like to take a moment here to thank all of our many partners who have helped us bring this conference virtually together. And so we'd like to just thank Colleen Lakes Eco Museum, the Citizens Environmental Alliance, Steps Unlimited Canada, the Last Mountain Lake Stewardship Group, the Lower Capel Watershed Stewards, Nature Saskatchewan, Public Pastures Public Interest, Saskatchewan Environmental Society, the Sierra Club Canada Foundation, Saskatchewan Alliance for Water Sustainability, and the Saskatoon Wildlife Federation. So lots of partners, lots of people involved, and we just want to say a big thank you. So that's all for me, and I hope to see you guys tomorrow. Have a good one.